I would like to start by putting ourselves in the shoes of an immigrant leaving Italy just before the First World War, pondering where to go, where to settle in search of a new life. The choice of our immigrant would be to catch a steamship, perhaps to New York, or possibly to Buenos Aires.
The Gresham College lecture that you're listening to right now is giving you knowledge and insight from one of the world's leading academic experts. Making it takes a lot of time, but because we want to encourage a love of learning, we think it's well worth it. We never make you pay for lectures, although donations are needed. All we ask in return is this: send a link to this lecture to someone you think would benefit, and if you haven't already, click the follow or subscribe button from wherever you're listening right now. Now, let's get back to the lecture.
In 1910, it would be a tough choice about which destination to choose. Argentina at that point was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But the choice made then would have great consequence for the migrants' descendants a century later. Let me start off by looking at the difference between income levels in the two countries and with other settler economies that exported primary products like wheat, such as Canada. And you see from this graph that Argentina, the blue line, starts off more or less on a par there with Canada, a bit below the United States, but then look at the huge divergence which starts to take place in the interwar period. Argentina now, along with other Latin American countries, lagging far behind in terms of income per head. So in 1929, just before the Great Depression, Argentina was still a member of that group of rich countries. From 1960s, as you should see on that graph, it would have been better for our migrants' grandchildren to have stayed in Italy. As a percentage of income levels of rich countries in the OECD, Argentina fell from about 84% of the average level of those rich countries in 1950 to 65% in 1973 and only 43% in 1987. By the early years of this century, income was only about 40% of the level of Western Europe, whereas, as we saw in 1910, it was on a par. So what went wrong is what I want to ask today. This is what is called by economists, historians, the Argentine paradox. How to explain a 60% relative drop in income levels. And as this graph shows, it was not just Argentina. Latin America as a whole did not do well, but you see that Chile, which I'll be coming on to at the end of my lecture, did start to improve in the 1970s. So we will need to be asking, why did Chile manage to pull ahead somewhat? To understand that more recent trajectory of Argentina, we should start from an understanding of its economy before the First World War. I'm a historian, so I like to start with the historic roots of the patterns which I'm looking at. Because it was the pattern set before the First World War which led to various problems. It led to social and political problems that limited the ability of Argentina to sustain growth and high income. And it led to a strategy of economic nationalism, particularly under Perón, which was based upon import substituting industrialization, an attempt to develop local industries that would replace imports of manufacturers from Europe and from the United States to go for self-sufficiency. So let me start then by looking at Argentina from its independence in the 1820s through to the beginning of the Great Depression in the 1920s. So Argentina secured independence from Spain in 1810, but that was followed by a long period of turmoil and warfare. The old Spanish viceroyalty broke up into different states. They had competing claims for land in the area. And that was linked with expansion from Buenos Aires the area around Buenos Aires, into the Pampas and into Patagonia. So this rather fanciful image is showing the War of the Desert of 1833 to 4, the attempt to drive out the indigenous people, and the conquest of the desert of the 1870s and 1880s. It involved the defeat, perhaps the genocide, of indigenous people. It also involved the suppression of the gauchos. These were people very often of mixed descent, of Indian mothers, Spanish fathers, who roamed the pampas, living off feral wild horses, cattle, and game. They fought against the Spanish in the wars of independence. They fought in the Spanish War, in the Desert War. But as the cattle ranchers started to settle and to put barbed wire around the pampas, they were seen now as being wild and uncivilized, and had to be forced to work on the ranches to become settled peons. So it's a period of instability. And a more settled political system emerged with the election of Julio Roca as president in 1880, and he remained a dominant figure for the next 20 or 30 years. He had been a leading general in the conquest of the desert, and he and the other so-called men of 1880 continued to be powerful, and the party that he led and founded continued to dominate right up to 1916, the Partido Autonomista Nacionalista. So they retained power despite quite a wide male franchise by ballot rigging, intimidation, and if all else failed, the president could impose his own wishes. And of course, he had the army at his disposal. So what we have here is a political system which is based upon an oligarchic autocracy. It's unlike other settler societies, such as Canada and Australia. They're growing the same sort of crops to the same markets, but they were not militarized in the same way. They didn't have civil war, didn't have conflicts with the neighbors. They also committed genocide or suppression of indigenous people, but not through the same sort of military process that I outlined there. Two Australian historians stress that there was a big contrast between what they call the stable, flexible government of Australia and the bad government of Argentina. And they see that going back to this period of the late 19th century as the key to the different trajectory which we still see today. The government of Argentina encouraged European migrants to replace what were viewed as those uncivilized wild gauchos. That migration into Argentina started on a large scale in the 1870s, attracted by higher wages than in Europe. By 1914, 40% of the population of Argentina was foreign-born, and many of them were Italian, who were distinct from the older Spanish migrants. Many of the Italians were urbanized, and many of them, this is an important point as I proceed in the lecture, they had sympathies with socialism and anarchism. Unlike Canada and Australia, where most of the migrants were predominantly from the UK, you have this more, if you like, mixed ethnic background. Now, some historians say that that is, again, a crucial difference. I'm a little bit wary about these sort of, if like, ethnic explanations. But at least some historians, and I quote, say a crucial difference was the political tradition and the origins of the immigrant population coming from Britain compared with Southern Europeans in Argentina. There seems to be a little bit of, if you like, Anglo-Saxon superiority about that argument. And I'm going to be putting forward a somewhat different take on why there were differences. One of the major differences, in fact, was the heavy reliance upon foreign capital, above all from Britain, to build railways, to open up the pampas, to build ports and meat packing stations and cold stores, and to provide utilities such as the gas and tramways here in Buenos Aires, which became a major world city with this branch of Harrods there and the fine sort of Parisian-style boulevards. A Grand Opera House, which was on a par with Milan, La Scala, and so on. So there's massive foreign investment from Britain. And the interest on those shares, on those bonds, of course, was being passed back to Britain, and the return being guaranteed by the Argentinian state. The major banks in Argentina were also British-owned, and their role as banks was to service the production of commodities for export. Argentina then was not formally part of the British Empire, but it was part of the informal British Empire. British overseas capital calls for Argentina were really extensive. You can see there where it was going into railways, going to the government, to the utilities I mentioned, but above all, building railways. And you see that the Argentina was the third most important destination after the United States and Canada, ahead of Australia. So we have this massive amount then of foreign capital going into Argentina. So there's a big difference from other settler economies. In Argentina, heavy reliance upon foreign capital, but a very low level of domestic saving. Domestic savings rate was about 10% lower in Argentina than in Australia and Canada between 1900 and 1929. So low domestic saving, heavy reliance upon capital from outside. Reliance upon capital outside means that is more expensive. The cost of capital were higher. The payment of interest on the capital, the payment of dividends on that foreign capital, took up a very large proportion of the government revenue of Argentina. And also we should note that politics were different between Argentina and Australia in this respect. In the case of Australia, about 2/3 of all the capital went to the government of Australia, the provincial or state governments and the federal government, so that loans were in the hands of representative bodies. So it was democratically controlled. And usually the firms or the utilities were operated by Australians. That was not the case in Argentina, where the ownership was very often outside here in London. So although in Australia in the 1920s to 30s there was resentment at the payment of interest on British loans, it was nothing like the scale that was found in Argentina. So the result of this economic and political system was an alliance between British capital, based here mainly in London, and owners of the large estates, de Sancha, to give us an example of one, which flourished in the late 19th and early 20th century on the basis of an export economy based upon wool, beef, and wheat. Well, if you're rich enough and so minded, you can now go and have a wonderful holiday there, living the life of a rancher, having a luxurious outdoor holiday, horseback, playing golf, shooting, whatever you fancy. These estancia emerge in the course of the 19th century. In the early 19th century, cattle and sheep were roaming over large tracts of unfenced land. The ranchers often used slaves until about 1850. There were a large number of sheep which were providing wool to Britain. That's what one of the major crops or commodities was initially. Before the development of refrigeration, cattle were used mainly to supply hides for leather, going to places in London like Bermondsey. And the carcasses of sheep and cattle were boiled down to produce tallow. And there you see the makeup of the exports from Argentina. So in 1854, about 1/3 of the exports were hides, about 8% in wool, and another third or so in tallow, for use in candles, grease, and so on, which is used in industry. And those were still the dominant trades in 1870. But then, from about 1870, with, say, the fencing in of the pampas, the nature of the export market started to change. The export of better quality meat and also wheat. So how did this economy work, this cattle economy, which has started to become so dominant? Well, cattle were bred on the pampas, on pasture which is being improved from its native quality. Those cattle were then sent to the coastal districts to be fattened up on better pasture. And that meat trade was initially in what was called jerked beef, air-cured and salted, which is largely sold up into the Caribbean and Brazil to be used on slave plantations. So it is a lower quality meat. But then you see the emergence of frozen beef coming in, massive expansion from 1894 up to the First World War, and the beginning of chilled beef, even if at higher quality rather than frozen. So this development is being controlled by largely British firms. There are huge enterprises, the ranches. One hacienda, the San Jacinto hacienda, had 100,000 cattle and 10,000 horses on 244 square miles. So these are massive ranches, but they're dominated by the cold store firms that are based on the coast. And those cold store firms and refrigerating plants and refrigerated ships were controlled by foreign interests, a very few firms. So unlike in Canada, Australia, where it was very often the ranchers controlled the trade, they would supply their cattle to the slaughterhouses and the meat packers. In this case, it's the meat packers dominate the internal trade. And most of those meat packers, refrigeration plants, were owned by, as you see here, the Anglo Company. This is the Vesties, who own, if some of you of a certain age like me can remember Dewhurst butcher shops on the high streets. They owned these big meat packing plants, slaughterhouses, cold storage in Buenos Aires, in London, just up the road here. They had one in Smithfield. They own the Blue Star refrigerated ships. It's one of the massive companies, one of the richest families still in Britain. William Vesty went out, first of all, to Chicago, sent by his father, who was a Liverpool produce merchant. He went to Chicago in 1876, then moved to Argentina in 1890. He opened his first cold store in Liverpool in 1890, set up the Union Coal Store, the Blue Star Line, and a chain of 2,635 butcher shops, as well as some cattle stations himself that he owned. So this system created an alliance of breeders, fatteners, railways, meat packers. It was a narrow oligarchy of large landowners who dominated the government, unlike the small farmers in other settler societies. They worked with British capital in a common interest in expanding exports. At the end of the 19th century, there was also a growth in wheat production for export. The acreage of wheat grew by tenfold between 1890 and 1914. But again, this wheat farming was unlike the pattern found in Australia and Canada. In Argentina, there were not very many small family-owned and farm properties. The farmers were predominantly tenants, and the land was held by the large owners who could turn it over at some point to cattle. It was a flexible system which allowed them to switch easily between wheat and cattle. The tenants, many of whom were Italian, would only hold the property for 3 years at a time. They would improve the property, improve the land, and then the landowners could take it back without compensation for the improvements which were being made. So the Argentinian tenant farmers were more or less nomadic. They didn't settle down in communities. They lived on a temporary basis in sort of shacks. They didn't have a very powerful community life. They didn't have such democratic politics. It was the large landowners who dominated and had enormous political power. And that reflected the land policy that was adopted by the government in Buenos Aires, or rather in Buenos Aires province and other provinces, because it was a provincial matter to decide how land was distributed, not the federal government, unlike in Canada and Australia, where the federal government decided. So in some provinces, like Santa Fe, the provincial government did try to support small farmers, but the major large provinces, the province of Buenos Aires, did not. They ensured that most land was held by large estates with an established landed elite. The tenants were often required by the landowners to grow a crop of alfalfa, which was used as feed for cattle. Now, you had the tenancy for 3 years. You would improve the land to grow the crop, but alfalfa will last probably for 15 years. So you can see there was a little bit of an exploitative relationship going on there. So this was a system which was more, if like, exploitative. And the tenants depended upon credit. They were often in debt, and they sold their wheat to a few large merchants who, again, could fix the price to the advantage of the merchants. So there was also immigration going to Argentina, but a lot of the profits, I'm suggesting, were going to the landowners. Let's contrast that with the experience of the prairies of Canada. There, family farms were much more powerful, more dominant, and tenancies were secure. And that reflected the land policy of the federal government. There was no established landed elite, and in Canada, the government adopted the homestead policy in 1872, which followed that of the United States of America of 1864, distributing land more or less free to anybody who was willing to settle on it. So you have owner-operated farmers, a settled population which built houses, communities, schools, churches, and very often had cooperative ownership of the grain elevators, so they were more controlling who made the profit from it. So you have this big difference, which you should see in this table here, showing how dominant owner-operators were in Canada compared with the Pampas in Argentina, where renters were dominating. So a big, if you like, social, political, economic difference between these areas. And much the same would apply to Australia as to Canada. So the prosperity of Argentina before the First World War rested upon circumstances that limited the prospects of long-term growth. So I'm suggesting that already, even when Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, there are limits to what could happen with long-term growth. And strains were already becoming apparent before 1914. One of those strains was over debt and finance. The economy was heavily indebted outside. The government also borrowed heavily. The cost of servicing the debt took up a high proportion of revenue, therefore it wasn't available for schools, for education, and so on. In 1890, there was a major recession. The servicing of the debt became really very, very difficult. And that exposed Baring Brothers, the great merchant bank based here in London, the dominant merchant bank for lending to Argentina. Barings almost went bust and had to be bailed out by the Bank of England. was potentially like the global financial crisis of 2008. Very, very serious, and that really hit Argentina as well. This threatened the political order in the area. The corruption of the government, the lack of political freedom and rights, the selling out to foreign interests. It led to the revolution in the park in 1890 in Buenos Aires, when the civic union protested against corruption of the government. They called for political rights, for freedom, for liberty. The president resigned, but little else changed. The Argentinian landowners were soon restored, and that nationalist party I mentioned of Roca regained control by rigging votes, gerrymandering, and presidential controls. But you also have a threat from the Italian immigrants that I talked about, many of whom were anarchists, socialists, syndicalists. And they were very powerful amongst immigrants in Buenos Aires. So they wished to overturn the state. It's really sort of threat to the political order as it was seen. And there were also grievances by the tenant farmers who went on strike in 1912. So the whole system here is looking very fragile, very strained already. Roca, whom I referred to back in 1880, he returned as president in 1898. He faced strikes by workers, challenges from the anarchists. And in 1891, the civic union made a deal with Roca, but they'd split. And you get now a new radical civic union, which led to further uprisings in 1893 and 1905. You have a new president, a new leader who eventually becomes president, Hippolyta Yrigoyen. He's opposing the oligarchy of this old oligarchy. He's trying to draw together middle-class people, business people, rural workers and settlers, and some cattle ranchers as well, in an attempt to overthrow this old oligarchy. In 1916, he does become president. The dominance of the old party of Roca is ended. But it doesn't lead to a massive change. Although he was elected president, he didn't control the parliamentary system, where the Conservatives could still block reform. And he still hoped to continue the old export-led model of growth based upon the export of wheat, of beef, and so on, with, of course, alliance with British capitalists. After the end of the First World War, he combined repression of strikes with some concessions to the workers in terms of minimum wage legislation. So he's combining something which Peron is going to do, if like repression with welfare benefits. So what I'm arguing here is that the whole basis of the Argentinian economy is very fragile. Argentinian prosperity in 1914, before 1914, was not upon a very secure basis. It rested upon a combination of exports dominated by great landowners, financed by British capital, that led to a corrupt oligarchic government with the support of the army. And that this oligarchic control was facing opposition from a variety of interests, from urban workers, small farmers, urban middle class, who thought that national interests had been abandoned and sold out to British capital. So this system was facing very serious challenge between the wars. And I now turn then to what happens with the Great Depression, which strikes in 1929. Well, Argentina had been prospering before the First World War on the basis of an open world economy, free movement of capital, free movement of labour, open trade. It could not work after the war when these conditions changed. Various things happened. If you have, you have a process of deglobalization, which had a very major impact on Argentina, as indeed it did on Canada and Australia. But what happens in Argentina is that policy choices make the situation far worse. So deglobalization hits all of these settler economies, undermining the model of growth that existed before 1914. Let me just mention the major things which happened. First of all is capital. There's a drop in the amount of foreign investment, as you see, in Argentina. So it comes down from 4% of GDP to 1.1% and even lower after that. So you're losing capital from overseas. But as I said earlier on, there's also less domestic saving. And you can see there the domestic saving rate within Argentina is much lower than it is in Australia and Canada. So what we have here is a lack of investment. Argentinian capital stock have been growing by about 5% a year between 1900 and 1913. But it then fell to only 2.2% between 1913 and 1929. A very remarkable drop in investment. And that contributes to the relative decline of Argentina. Less capital per worker, lower productivity than in Australia and Canada. So that's one major change. That relies upon foreign capital and low level of domestic saving. And there's also a big change in trade. There was the end of the expansion of the frontier, the opening up of more and more areas of the pampas for growing wheat and raising cattle. So that expansion era has come to an end. But also, of course, there's a collapse in world trade more generally. And here we have Argentinian exports and imports as a percentage of GDP. And notice it goes down from about 80% of GDP before the war to about 20%. It's a massive drop in the level of trade. So the worldwide collapse of open trade. European markets are closed off by protective tariffs, a drive to autarky. And Britain decides to opt for imperial preference, buying crops from Canada and Australia, not from Argentina. But there's also a big difference in policy option which goes on, which intensifies that difference. In Canada in the 1920s, the leading Liberal politician needed to have electoral support from farmers, tried to encourage the exports, build up the agrarian sector. In Argentina, that was not so much the case, where Irigoyen, I mentioned, is more reliant upon the support of urban voters in Buenos Aires and getting the radical civic union. These differences in state support and in the level of investment means a big difference takes place then in the quality of the produce. Canada pulled ahead both in the quality and the quantity. Canada is investing in better types of grain, it's better facilities, grading of wheat, preserving the quality, better marketing, better elevators which are owned cooperatively. So there's been a big difference in the two areas. And also, Canada favoured encouraging industry which is exporting, which was able to do across the border into the United States of America. That was not so easy for Argentina to do. Argentina turned to import substituting industrialization, tried to encourage its own industries to replace imports from Britain and the United States. Now, I've been talking here about Argentina. I should say that every country in Latin America, all major economies in Latin America, had the same problems. Same thing applied to Chile, which was an exporter of mainly nitrates and copper, to Brazil with its coffee, rubber. All of them were facing the same problems in the interwar period. Those problems were a fall in the terms of trade, the amount of manufactured commodities you could buy for a particular unit of export commodities. The price of export commodities dropped by about a third compared with the price of manufactured goods which were being imported. The economies of Latin America were highly dependent upon trade, as I showed from Argentina. So with a fall in the value of those commodities and in the quantity of those commodities, it also hits the tax revenues because they relied upon the export duties on a lot of these commodities. So they're hit in their revenue. So all of this has a major impact. Fall in the price of commodities, fall in the quantity of commodities, it's immediately going to hit the level of the economy. One response then is to devalue your currency. If you devalue the currency, you have to pay even more money to service your foreign debt. And the cost of servicing the foreign debt was as much as 70% of total government revenue in some countries in Latin America. So it's a really serious crisis. And a common response throughout Latin America and in Argentina was to turn from this export-led growth to the import-substituting industrialization. Develop local industries to replace imported manufactures, often complemented by labour codes that gave a right to workers to unionize within a corporatist system of conciliation boards which represented workers, employers, and the state. That was a way of containing radical working class movements, but it was a way then of building this corporatist economy, which some people would see as being on the same lines as fascist Italy. People like Vargas in Brazil were particularly keen on building up this sort of system. So the political situation in the 1920s in Argentina and in other countries in Latin America was unstable. Irigoyen was forced out of the presidency. The radical civic union I mentioned that he was leading split. The old ruling elite makes a return. But there were continued threats from the anarchists, the emergence of the Liga Republicana based upon Italian fascism. So there's continuations throughout the 1920s of political unrest at this time of economic turmoil. The impact of the Depression then led to an army coup in 1930 that removed the radical civic union from power and repressed the opposition. The leader of that coup in 1930 was part of a far-right nationalist movement that had emerged even before the First World War. It's a far-right group that opposed socialism, but also opposed liberalism. It supported the Catholic Church and its hierarchy, the large landed estates, expressed hostility to foreigners. It wanted to regain land ceded to neighbouring states like Uruguay. It aimed to create an organic corporate society that would restore harmony between classes on the lines of the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891. So the general who launched the coup in 1930 was part of that far-right movement. He was considered to be too far-right even by the other generals who replaced him in 1932 by a more moderate general, if such a thing is possible. And thereafter, the government was in the hands of a military-oriented conservative elite with continued conflict with radicals and fascists. The 1930s has been called the infamous decade. In 1933, a treaty was reached with Britain to sell some commodities from the pampas, the wheat and cattle, to Britain, but at a very modest level compared with what was coming from Canada and Australia, and with strings attached, that Argentina had to buy British goods. The market had to be controlled by British merchants, by British firms in Argentina. So, of course, that stirs up even more nationalist outcry. A new central bank is set up to stabilise the currency, but it is under advice from the Bank of England. The government does introduce strict regulations to support prices to try and limit overproduction, because this can then lead to great rigidities in the economy. The currency is depreciated, high tariffs are introduced. So in pushing this import substituting industrialisation, the market is being distorted. High prices for capital combined with, if like, lack of investment. So there's, again, this rather rigid system which is not able to respond very well to what is happening during the 1930s, a trade war, rising tensions throughout the world. In 1943, there is another military coup. And we have the emergence of Peronism. After the coup of 1943, Peron became the Minister for Labour. He's an army officer. He worked with trade unions, and that led to resentment from his colleagues in the military junta. He's working with the trade unions to improve the conditions. It looks as if he's becoming too popular. He was dismissed and imprisoned, but then was released on popular demand, and in 1946 was elected president, and of course his wife, Eva, was highly popular and politically active. Peron is really building upon the policies I was outlining of that, if you like, far-right general I referred to, who came to power in 1930, and building upon import substituting industrialisation. He was advocating a policy of social justice, economic independence, political sovereignty designed to restore the moral and material greatness of Argentina. To coin a phrase, he wanted to make Argentina great. It was an anti-capitalist, populist nationalism, a third way, as he saw it, between communism and the free market. The ideology is difficult to pin down. To some, it was a form of fascism. To others, it was a sort of left-wing populism. To others, it was even something more akin to Roosevelt's New Deal. So Peron had been part of the coup of 1930. He had some similarities with that ideology I outlined. But after he lost power in 1955, and before he regained power in 1973, he turned to the left. He supported Castro. He was welcomed by Catholic liberation theology. And Peronism has continued to be this rather difficult thing to pin down, different ideological strands, ranging from socialism to paternalistic conservatism. And you see there on the screen some of the main principles. Let me just outline some of them very quickly. It's a true democracy is one in which the government does what the people want. It protects only interests of the people. It's of the common people. The elite is anti-people. There's only one class of persons, those who work. Working creates the dignity of man. It's a duty. It's fair that everybody should produce as much as they consume. That's against the little rentier group. Two arms are social justice and social help. Justice and love to the people. It balances the right of the individual and society. It wants a social market, puts capital to the service of the economy. It carries out social justice, which gives each person their rights in accordance to their social functions. It wants an Argentina which is socially fair, economically free, and politically sovereign. You can see how that could be taken in all sorts of different directions. What did he actually try to do? Well, first of all, you have a 5-year plan of 1947 to 51. It aimed to increase pay, achieve full employment, develop industry, improve social welfare, in close association with the trade union movement. So a central feature was redistribution in favour of workers through subsidies, taxation of the rich, fiscal deficits, investing through having an unbalanced budget. How do you do that? Well, you use seigniorage. You print money. Printing money leads to inflation. The average inflation rate from 1944 to today has been about 190% per annum. But companies were not allowed to adjust their financial statements to allow for higher costs. They were being taxed on the increase in the value which is created by the government's inflation. This is what's called an inflation tax. Basically, the government was taxing inflation, which it had itself created. And that, of course, is one of the key differences from Canada and Australia, where you don't have rapid inflation, where you do have a fairer tax system and capital investment. What we're having here is a violation of property rights. Inflation is inflating away people's savings. Peron, although he's working with the trade unions, is also involving industrialists. It's a corporatist society. And he's particularly working with a man called Miguel Miranda, who formed a close relationship with Peron by running the State Industrial Bank and the so-called National Post-War Council. What he was aiming to do was to close the gap between the rich and the poor, freeing Argentina from dependence on exports. What he was doing was taxing the export sector, these ranchers, to finance forced industrialization, but inefficient forced industrialization. Nationalizing the British foreign-owned transport companies, utilities, electricity, ports, you see here on this publicity poster. But of course, that was a problem about how to pay for it. And how did you pay for it? Well, Miranda's answer was to set up the Institute for the Promotion of Trade. Basically, this institute bought all of the harvest and the cattle from the ranchers at a low price and then tried to sell it on the overseas markets at a large profit. That profit would then be reinvested in state-sponsored industry and economic development. It would also pay for welfare schemes, higher wages to boost the domestic market. So, obviously, those policies are going to be opposed by the landowners, and there was very justified suspicion that most of the money was actually going into Miranda's own pocket for his own personal advantage. Well, inflation, this very expensive policy of nationalisation and so on, it was soon led the economy to collapse. Foreign reserves, which had been built up during the war, were used to pay for nationalisation and to modernise the armed forces. The balance of payments deteriorated. In order to industrialise, you need to import capital goods to build the new industries, but you don't have the revenue from the exports. Very high level of devaluation of the currency. Workers were hit by falling wages, by austerity. Miranda was dismissed in 1949. A second 5-year plan was introduced, which tried to show a little bit more concern for agriculture, but still there was inflation, austerity, need to increase taxes, unrest, opposition, and Peron was overthrown in 1955. A period of social unrest, political unrest, violence follows with disorder between right and left. Peron briefly returned as president in 1973, but died in 1974 when he was succeeded by his wife, not Eva, another wife. So what I want to pick up now is then, what happens to this import substituting industrialisation? Can anything be done to improve the situation? I'm just going to make 2 points here about what then happens to import substituting industrialisation. And that is going to take me across the Andes to Chile in 2 ways. The first is to go across the Andes to Santiago, to a body set up by the United Nations called the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, whose head was a man called Raúl Prebisch, an Argentinian economist who had been head of the Central Bank of Argentina until he went into exile under Peron. He supported import substituting industrialisation, but he said the solution was not purely nationalist. The solution, he said, was to change the whole structure of the international economy. He said the big problem was that collapse in the price of agricultural commodities or primary products like copper from Chile compared with manufactured commodities. That the whole world economy was stacked against the primary producing countries. They were getting to technological advance. Workers there got higher wages. They were unionized. They could keep higher wages. Workers in the Latin American countries didn't have such good bargaining power. The countries there didn't have such good bargaining power. What he wanted to do was to work through a new body of which he became the head in 1964, UNCTAD, the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development. And the idea here was for international policy to force up the price of primary products against those of manufactured commodities, to rebalance the world economy for distributive justice. Well, you can imagine what the advanced countries of the world in the World Bank, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs said about that, which was basically, forget it. So you have this, if like, structuralist approach. Prebisch started to change his mind and said that, right, if we're going to have import substituting industrialization and it's going to work, we need to have a common market for the whole of Latin America because individual nations are too small. We need to have a common market for Latin America, which he tried to sell to Kennedy when Kennedy was president in the United States. So there's a beginning of a movement away from this sort of extreme nationalist Peronism. There's more what I call a structuralist approach. It doesn't really work because it's difficult to get the advanced countries of the dominating the international institutions to accept that point. There's the modernist office of ECLAC in Santiago, and there's Raoul Prebisch at the meeting at ECLAC putting these views forward. But also in Chile, you have, of course, another person, Pinochet. And I think we need to understand what is happening there. Now, we start off, of course, with Allende winning the election as a socialist until he is overthrown by Pinochet in 1973, whom he perhaps unwisely appointed as being the head of the army. Before the coup, the economy of Chile, like that of Argentina, was in a mess. All imports needed a license. Duties ranged from 0 to 250%. There were 10 exchange rates for the currency. Importers had to make a deposit of 10,000% of the value of imports while they were in transit. Agriculture was hit by the high costs of equipment, of fertilizers, and the exchange rate changing all the time. Manufactured goods had a high level of protection, but the market was too small. They were very inefficient. In 1955, the State Department of the United States introduced the Chile Project, which is to train Chilean economists at the University of Chicago, notorious, of course, for free market economics. From the late 1950s, within Chile, there's then a war of ideas. The Chicago boys were based at the Catholic University. They favoured free trade, and they argued against the economists at the University of Chile, who favoured Prebisch's view, structuralist view. To the Chicago boys, import substituting industrialization and structuralism led to inefficiencies. They argued for trade liberalisation. They argued for devaluation of the currency to make goods more competitive. They argued for the abolition of price controls, which were leading to rigidities in the market and inefficiencies. They argued for freeing up interest rates so that they could find their equilibrium and improve economic efficiency. Now, initially, they didn't make much headway. But in 1970, they didn't make much headway when they presented their case to the Conservative presidential candidate, who said, and I quote, "Get these crazy guys out of here and make sure they never come back." Well, they did come back. They came back in opposition to Allende, when army officers commissioned them to write a report. It was so fat, it was called The Brick. It was so big. And this brick argued that they should try to do the policies of opening up. When Allende was overthrown and Pinochet came in, Pinochet himself was a little bit wary because a lot of army officers were nationalist. A lot of industrialists, of course, did not want to lose their protectionism. But after a few years of his government, he did decide to throw his lot in with the Chicago boys against the nationalist officers and against the business people whose wealth rested on protectionism. He was convinced by Milton Friedman, who came on a visit in 1975, and he appointed Sergio Castro as Minister of Economics, the most senior of the Chicago boys. Now, I think that what they were introducing was not, in fact, Milton Friedman's type of outright doctrinaire neoliberalism. It was a more pragmatic neoliberalism. They wanted to combine the market and privatization and competitiveness in exports and foreign investment, but with some sort of belief that the state should have a guiding hand, if not complete planning, then a sort of guiding hand over the process. So it wasn't going to be like the outright free marketeer. It's going to try to reduce extreme poverty by targeted social programs, reform of the pension system, for example. They stopped the outright land reform, which Allende was going in for, and encouraged farmers to grow crops like peaches and apricots and avocados, which could be sold to the north in the off-season. They didn't want to go for complete and utter free trade, but some sort of a compromise between this. So the market has a role combined with decentralized planning. I think that policy which introduced was then continued very much after the return of democracy in 1990. Many of those ideas were continued both by Christian Democrats and by socialist governments in Chile, alongside improved welfare policies. It's been defined as inclusive neoliberalism. So the idea that there is a very, if like, simple Washington consensus of neoliberalism, it doesn't seem to be quite right. Well, my conclusion then, let's pull out the main stories out of this. As I said at the beginning, there was a 60% drop in Argentina's relative income. Same thing happened in many other countries, but as you see, Chile started to recover some of its share from the 1970s and 1980s. Why was there this massive drop? Well, it goes back to the agrarian structure of large estates versus the small family farms of other settler societies. It's about the ownership of large estates being in alliance with British capital, and that British capital needed to cover low savings rate internally, but also leading to resentment more than other settler societies. When capital imports dropped, there was low savings, lack of investment, inefficiency, low productivity. The political system lacked stability. The autocratic power of the conservative elites led to opposition from socialists, anarchists, populist hostility to foreign control. Then it turned to import substituting industrialisation under Peron. The state policies limited growth. Import substituting industrialisation distorted the economy with subsidies, controls and tariffs. And that reliance upon inflation as a strategy of finance was destructive of property rights. Now, we could think back, if any of you heard my previous lecture on South Korea and Japan, to what they did. There, governments were very clear that they should not be controlled by foreign capital, that they should build up a high level of domestic savings. Their states had a clear industrial strategy, but it was based upon exports in key sectors. Now, the question which is facing us now, facing Argentina now, with its new president, is can Argentina break from its current problems of regain its position. Well, I don't think the prospects are very bright. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Daunton. Actually, to continue on that,
Yes.
on that question, someone is actually interested in, following the recent IMF intervention, what does the future hold for Argentina's economy?
Well, historians are very good at looking at the past and not so good looking at the future. I don't think the prospects look very, very good. I think in a way it's a continuation of the story that I've been telling. Rapid inflation, devaluation of currencies, a flight of people away from Argentina. I was very struck this morning in the Guardian newspaper, a story which actually picks up what I was saying at the beginning about did you make the right decision in 1910 to migrate from Italy to Argentina? The story in The Guardian today is that a lot of doctors are leaving, Italian doctors, heritage doctors, are leaving Buenos Aires to go and work in Sicily because of the mess that the economy is in there. I was just hinting there at the end about the new president in Argentina. Does he have the solution to what's going on there? Well, Milei is, I'm not sure exactly how to categorize him. One categorization is that he's a libertarian economist, far right. Take control of everything. He's even been described as an anarcho-capitalist. Anarcho-capitalism, if any of you have read the book by Quinn Slobodian, Crack-Up Capitalism, is a way of, hollowing out the state and creating areas of economies which are completely outside any sort of state control. So it's difficult to see exactly what he's doing. The situation in Chile is also very interesting. I referred to the pension reform in Chile, which in many ways it was a precursor of the sort of pension reform that we've had with self-employed pensions and that sort of thing. Well, there's been riots in Santiago against the pension reforms, which are not delivering the sort of level of income which is had been anticipated, had been promised. So the prospects there of Chile, which I was saying looked as if whatever one might think about the appalling behaviour of the government there, the economy did recover, and some of the policies were then followed up afterwards. It now looks as if that's hit the buffers. So I'm a bit gloomy. Sorry.
Can I please ask you, there have been several things you have mentioned, totally ignoring the severe differences in all these Latin American countries. But there are several things you've said several times. First and foremost, can I correct you? Salvador Allende was not overthrown by Pinochet. Salvador Allende was murdered. The declassified documents from the CIA are clear. CIA involvement, murdered in his palace. Last year, several articles analyzed and mentioned that situation again. He was not overthrown, he was murdered by Pinochet. You said twice the danger of anarchist and socialism to the economy. And then you said again, hostilities to foreign control. I think what you haven't mentioned here is the enormous inequalities and the gross poverty that existed in all these Latin American countries, and that for centuries it was the control of foreign companies. Yep. The cannibalization of the resources of the Latin American countries by Spain, Canada, America, with their companies, that caused these economic instabilities in Latin America. Could you please say something about that?
Right,
because you have totally ignored that aspect of it.
First of all, on Allende, whether or not he was murdered or committed suicide, I think the government was overthrown, it was replaced, so I don't see we agreed that whether the government ended by whatever process. The CIA was obviously involved, American corporations were involved, the government was overthrown. I thought I had talked about the way in which foreign capital controlled and took out profits from these countries. It's not only true of what I'm saying in Argentina, it's true of Chile, where the copper companies were owned by US companies. It's true of Honduras or wherever with United Fruit. It's true of Venezuela with the oil companies. Within a lecture which is already too long, I thought I'd concentrate upon Argentina, where the ownership of British capital was obviously huge and was deeply resented. But it's different from Australia and Canada, where a lot of the money there went to the governments of those countries which controlled it democratically. So there's a difference in how foreign capital is perceived. So I think I was making the point that you're making. I think we agreed that there wasn't a lot of extraction from these economies, which would have started, of course, under the previous imperial regimes of the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire. So I don't think we're widely apart on that. And of course, there's huge inequalities, poverty within these countries. So yeah, I don't think we're actually disagreeing.
Moving forward, actually, someone is asking: did the debt crisis experience in Latin America in the early 80s contribute to the ideological actually consolidation of the Washington Consensus that you described, or neoliberalism in general?
Yeah. Okay. So you're thinking of the 1982 debt crisis in Latin America, and then subsequent ones. I think that's a really interesting story to be told. I think what's happening there is there's a huge flood of money going into the countries of Central America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, from money which is produced by the oil shock of 1973. So you have a huge amount of petrodollars which need to be recycled. And whereas the period I'm talking about, the foreign capital is going into these countries largely through bonds and equities in companies, these petrodollars are being put by commercial banks into what are largely authoritarian regimes. And Eduardo Altamura at the University of Manchester is now doing a big project on the provision of this commercial capital through banks into authoritarian regimes. And some of it is actually quite astonishing, which plays to your point with the question, that people like Lloyds Bank, the archives are open, are saying, well, yeah, fine, it's great to lend to these authoritarian regimes. They created stability. People might be disappearing. They might be, but hey, this is safe. Nicholas Ridley, the Conservative cabinet minister, said words more or less to that effect. And of course, Margaret Thatcher was, I think, a supporter of Pinochet. Pinochet is sometimes seen as the beginning of neoliberalism. So I think that, like, financialization, that movement of the banks back into this system is a very important issue. But I think we also need to be a bit careful. The Washington Consensus can be used as a catch-all phrase of extreme neoliberalism. But the recent book by Sebastian Edwards, which is on the Pinochet government, he was actually involved himself as part of that as an economist, is saying that actually there are different strands of neoliberalism. So he was saying that the Chicago boys from the Catholic University were pragmatic neoliberals, and they were following somebody from the University of Chicago, Harburger, who was not as rigid as Friedman. So I think that the new work on neoliberalism is trying to tease out differences within neoliberalism. So,
well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. We're already more than 10 minutes past, I'm afraid. But I believe this conversation about the role of the state actually is going to continue next year. Professor Daunton is coming back in the autumn, and he will talk about cities, collective action versus private markets in a series of 3 rather exciting lectures. Well, please join me in thanking again Professor Martin Daunton.